In this video, we're going to continue looking at multiplying polynomials, but we're going to look at it from a different perspective. So let's start with an example. We have x plus 3 times x plus 1. And we've seen that we can multiply these two using the FOIL method. First, we multiply our first pieces. That's x times x. That would be the f in FOIL. Then we multiply our outer pieces, which would be 1 times x. That's our O. Then we multiply our inner pieces. That would be 3 times x. That's our I. And finally, we multiply our last pieces. It's 3 times 1. So I'm going to color code each of these pieces before we move forward. Okay, let's simplify this expression. We have x times x. That would be x squared. Then we have 1 times x, or just x. Then we have 3 times x, or just 3x. And finally, we have 3 times 1, which gives us 3. This leaves us with x squared. And then we have to add some x's. We have 1x plus 3x's. That leaves us with 4x's. And we have our plus 3 at the end. So I color-coded this so that we can notice that this piece at the beginning, that comes from our f. Our final piece here comes from our L, our last pieces. And our piece right here in the middle, that comes from our O plus our I. So now that we know where each piece in our answer comes from, what we want to do in this video is start with our final answer, something that looks like that, and figure out what were the two pieces that we multiplied at the beginning. So let's try that. Let's work with our same problem. We'll have x squared plus 4x plus 3. So what we want to do is figure out what were the two pieces that we multiplied together. So we know our first term here comes from multiplying the first pieces. So what two things do we multiply to get x squared? Well, we can multiply x times x. That would mean that in our two pieces that we multiply, our first piece is x. All right. Well, let's look at our final piece here. We know we get that from multiplying our last pieces together. And what two numbers can you multiply to get 3? You multiply 1 times 3. So we can place those over here. We have our plus 1 and x plus 3. Again, our two pieces that we multiply are always going to be two numbers added times two numbers added. Now, finally, we want to deal with this piece right here. So we know that our middle piece comes from O plus I. So all we need to do is check, does our O plus I equal 4x? Our O plus I, our outer plus inner, so that would be 3 times x, or 3x, plus our inner, which is 1 times x, or x. That leaves us with 4x. So that confirms that we have the correct polynomials to multiply. So we can say that x squared plus 4x plus 3 equals x plus 1 times x plus 3. Don't worry if this seems a little confusing, it takes some practice. It's a bit of a puzzle, almost, to work through these problems. And let's look at a little vocab before we move on. If you see an expression like this that starts with an x squared, that is called a quadratic expression. And the quad part of the word, that means square. So if you see an expression that starts with an x squared, that's a quadratic expression. And we saw that our quadratic expression is equal to two polynomials multiplied together. And each of these is called a factor. These are factors. And factors are just things that you multiply together. So we'll have something that looks like x plus smiley face, just a number in disguise, times x plus heart. So we're going to work through a few examples where we start with a quadratic expression and we want to figure out what are the two factors. What are the two pieces that we multiply together? In our quadratic expressions, they'll usually start with an x squared, so we know that our first piece is always going to be x times x. And what that means is we need to figure out what is our smiley face and heart. What are these two numbers in disguise? So let's do some practice. Factor the expression, meaning find the two factors. So we have x squared plus 9x plus 18. Again, from our FOIL method, we know that our first piece comes from the f, our first terms. Our middle term is o plus I, and our final term is L. And so what two things do we multiply to get x squared? That would be x times x. That's always going to be the easiest piece. Now let's look at that 18. What two numbers can you multiply to get 18? Well, there's quite a few. Let's write down some examples. You could have 1 times 18. You could have 2 times 9. 3 times 6. Let's start with that. So we know our first terms are going to be x and x. So we're going to have something that looks like x plus smiley face times x plus heart. We just need to figure out what is our smiley face and heart. So again, it's kind of a puzzle. We have to try out different options for our smiley face and heart and figure out what are the right numbers. So on our first line, we have x plus 1 times x plus 18. So here we're trying out 1 and 18 as our last numbers, as our last pieces. And how do we know if those are the correct ones? We know they're correct if o plus I equals 9x. So let's have another column here for o plus I. And let's check. O plus I here is 18x plus 1x, and that is equal to 19x. So in this case, if we had two factors, x plus 1 times x plus 18, our o plus I would be 19x. That is not what we want. So that means this is not the correct answer. And when you find a couple factors, you can always FOIL them just to check. So for multiplying our first pieces, we have x squared, and then our outer pieces, 18x plus x, and then plus our last pieces, 1 times 18 is 18. That gives us x squared plus 19x plus 18. So in our factors, we found our first and last pieces, and we needed to check if our middle piece worked out. Well, this is 19x, but we want 9x. So that means this is not correct. So let's try another option for our smiley face and heart. Our next option says 2 and 9. So we could have x plus 2 times x plus 9. If we multiply this out, we would get our x squared from our first pieces, and we'd get our 18 from our last pieces. Now we just need to check if our o plus I equals 9x. Here we have o, which is 9x, plus I, 2x, that equals 11x. So our o plus I is not correct. That means these two factors, when we multiply them out, it gives us a different quadratic expression. So there's going to be a lot of trial and error here. It's sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. You'll have to try different pieces to see what fits. So let's try 3 and 6 here. For our smiley face and our heart, we could have x plus 3 times x plus 6. Now we need to check if our o plus I equals 9x. So o would be 6x. Then we have our i's 3x. That leaves us with 9x. So we found it. We found what our smiley face and heart should be. And you can always double check this by foiling it. So first piece is x times x is x squared, plus our o, which is 6x, plus I, 3x, plus our last, 3 times 6 is 18, leaving us with x squared plus 9x plus 18. And that is what we want. So again, this might seem a little confusing. I encourage you to review our part 2 video where we're multiplying polynomials, and make sure you really understand that before trying this video, because this video we're going backwards. And so if you're having trouble going forwards, you're going to have a lot of trouble going backwards. Alrighty, so we can conclude here that x squared plus 9x plus 18, our quadratic expression, is equal to x plus 3 times x plus 6. Those are our two factors. Okay, let's try another one. Factor the expression x squared minus 6x plus 8. Again, it's helpful to write our FOIL above each of these pieces so we know where each of them comes from. So when we're trying to factor this, we know that our x squared comes from two things multiplied together. Again, that's probably going to be the easiest. We know it's going to be x times x. So we're going to have something that, again, looks like our x plus smiley face times x plus heart. And our smiley face and heart, they come from our last piece, our 8 here. So what two numbers can we multiply to get 8? Well, you could multiply 1 and 8. You could do 2 and 4. And you can do negatives too. You could have -1 times -8 and -2 times -4. These also, when multiplied, equal 8. So we have a few examples here to test out. We want to figure out what our smiley face and heart are. Again, it's sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. We want to figure out which is the right piece. So let's try it out. Our first option has x plus 1 times x plus 8. And it doesn't matter where you put the 1 or 8. X plus 1 times x plus 8 is the same as x plus 8 times x plus 1. You can multiply them either way. Now we need to check out our o plus I. In this case, outer is 8x plus inner is x. That equals 9x. And that is not correct because we want a -6x. That is our o plus I. So we can cross this out. Let's try the next one. We have x plus 2 times x plus 4. Checking our o plus I, we have 4x plus 2x gives us 6x, but we want a -6x, so this is also not correct. All right, going to our next option. So we'll have x plus, and then we'll put in our -1 for the smiley face, and then x plus -8 for our heart. O plus I will have -8x minus x. That equals -9x. And that is not what we want. Our fourth option that we're trying, we have an x plus, and we'll put in a -2 for our smiley face, and then a -4 for our heart. That gets our first and last pieces. And now we have to check O plus I. So we have -4x minus 2x. That equals -6x. So we found it. We see that our option here is correct. And we can conclude that our expression x squared minus 6x plus 8 is equal to x plus -2, or just x minus 2, times x minus 4. And as you get more familiar with these problems, you won't even actually try these first two options. And why is that? Well, you know that your O plus I has to be a negative number, a -6, and that means you need to have a negative number in here somewhere. And looking at x plus 1 times x plus 8 and x plus 2 times x plus 4, you'll easily be able to see that your O plus I is going to have to be positive. There's no negative number in there. You would go straight to these options down here, and that would get you quicker to the answer. So that's just a skill that you'll develop as you work through these problems. You'll get a better feel for which numbers might work for smiley face and heart. And remember, this is a skill. This takes practice. But over time, your understanding will improve, and so will your speed. So let's try one more example. And we'll make this one a bit more challenging. Factor the expression and we have 3x squared minus 20x minus 7. So this might look a little scary, but there's nothing to be afraid of. You know exactly what to do. Let's start off by writing our FOIL above each piece. This problem's a little different because instead of x squared, we have 3x squared. That means when we factor, our first piece isn't going to be x and x. So what are they going to be? Well, what two things can you multiply to get 3x squared? You multiply 3x and x. So instead of x plus smiley face and x plus heart, we'll have 3x plus smiley face and x plus heart. Our first pieces multiplied together give us our 3x squared. All right, again, let's look at our last piece here. We have -7. So what two numbers for our smiley face and heart give us -7? Well, you can multiply -1 times 7. You can multiply 1 times -7. I think that's it. Those are the only whole numbers we can multiply to get to -7. So let's test it out. So looking at our first option for -1 and 7, we put those in for our smiley face and heart. But in this problem, there's actually two different ways to put them in. So we have 3x plus -1 times x plus 7, or we could have 3x plus 7 times x plus -1. Our first line is different from our second line here, and that's because of that 3x. That changes the game. So let's look at our O plus I. Our O is 7 times 3x, which is 21x. And our I is -1 times x minus x, which gives us 20x. That is not what we want. We want -20x. Okay, let's try our second option. Our O is -1 times 3x, which gives us -3x. Our I is 7 times x, or 7x, which gives us 4x. And that is not what we want. All right, we'll have to try our second pair of numbers here. So we have 3x plus 1 times x plus -7. And another option would be 3x plus -7 times x plus 1. Again, recognize that we have two different options here. They're not the same thing. So let's look at our O plus I. In our first option, we have O is negative 7 times 3x, or negative 21x, plus 1 times x, which is plus x. That gives us negative 20x. And that's what we want. We were looking for our O plus I to be negative 20x. So we found our answer. We don't even need to check our final option here because we found what we wanted. We found the correct puzzle piece. So we don't have to try another one. All right. So we can conclude that our quadratic expression, our 3x squared minus 20x minus 7, is equal to the two factors 3x plus 1 times x minus 7. And if you want to double check that you have the correct factors, you can always use the FOIL method to multiply these two, and you'll see that they are indeed equal to our quadratic expression. I hope this stretches your mind a bit. It is a challenging topic, so be sure to do plenty of problems and ask questions in the comments.